I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks everyone for coming. So as Shirley mentioned, I work for AWC, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and I'll be talking about one of our more regional projects, which is in the Pilliga Forest, which is between Narrabri and Coonabarabran, so only a couple of hours, 2 hours west of here. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the Gamilaroi people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, and to also acknowledge traditional owners across the country generally, and their connection to country, their connection to wildlife, and connection to culture. So today, for those of you who are not familiar with Australian Wildlife Conservancy, it is one of the largest not-for-profit environmental and science-based organisations in Australia. It is the largest private property owner for the purposes of conservation. And as you can see, the extent of reach of AWC is fairly widespread across the country now, which is fantastic to see. AWC owns a lot of properties, but in more recent years has moved into a new model of developing partnerships with private landholders and more recently with government. And the project that I am talking about today, which is in the Pilliga, so fairly nearby, is actually a partnership with the New South Wales Government. So it's one of 3 projects of this type that the New South Wales Government is instrumental in funding. So we work very closely with National Parks and Wildlife Service. So the Pilliga Forest is the largest consolidated block of temperate woodland in Western New South Wales. So it has significant conservation value to start with. So it's a very good site and a very good opportunity for this type of project. Our project is 35,500 roughly hectares in the north of the Pilliga Forest, bounded by that red line on the map, and we have a fenced area, which is the blue line within it, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So the objectives of the program is to really, it's very much a restorative-based project around restoring the Pilliga to as close as to what it was before European settlement, essentially. And one of the big issues for the Pilliga, because a lot of people look at it and think, well, it's a large tract of woodland, so, you know, if it's protected, you know, why do we need to do too much to it? But it is very, very different to what it was, you know, before European settlement. Firstly, there's been massive loss of small to medium ground-based mammals in that system. So there's been 19 of the 26 animals, which is 76%, that are just no longer in the Pilliga Forest at all. So, and that's for a couple of reasons. Probably the biggest driver of those extinctions, as we're probably all very much aware, are feral predators, foxes and cats, which are very much in the Pilliga Forest right through it. Obviously, there are other risks associated with grazing of feral herbivores. In the early days, surrounding farmers just used to let stock wander through. Fire regimes changed from the original traditional owners and the fire practices that they implemented. So there's been a lot of changes, and there's also been logging as well. So all of those have effectively changed the forest, changed the structure of the forest, allowed feral predators to get in, and that's decimated a lot of the wildlife in the area. So I suppose we've got a multi-step process with this project. There's no point, ultimately what we want to do is to restore some of that native wildlife and bring some of those species back. But there's no point doing that if you don't deal with the threats. And obviously for the small to medium-sized mammals, the biggest threat is predators. So AWC has a lot of experience now building feral predator fences, which is a really good way of dealing with the feral predator issue until we find, I mean, it's not ideal that we need fences, but if we are serious about protecting our native wildlife, unfortunately that is the only thing that we really have at the moment in some systems until we find better ways of controlling feral cats and foxes. So it's really, I suppose, an insurance at the moment until we find a better way of dealing with that key threat. So we've built a fence, which is 5,800 hectares in size, which you saw on the map All the feral predators have been eradicated, as well as feral herbivores. We've reintroduced some regionally extinct mammals, and we've got more to go. We manage the land for conservation, and that's an ongoing process. And one of the key things, and I think there was one of the presenters was saying earlier today, monitoring the impacts, it's so critical. And, you know, for anyone working in the conservation land care space, monitoring the impacts and learning from that monitoring, you know, it's fine. If something doesn't work, it's actually good to know about it so that you can improve it and refine it and move on and get good outcomes. So monitoring impacts and sharing are equally important for this type of project. So this is the fence. As I said, it's 5,800 hectares in size, 32 kilometres. And it's not a matter of putting the fence up and walking away. This needs ongoing maintenance. So we have 3 fence checks a week, and that will go, you know, that needs to happen for the life of this project until at some point the fence might come down because we can control feral predators outside the fence. So it's a very big resource and it requires a lot of ongoing resources to keep that feral predator-free status inside the fence. It's very easy for trees to fall down that can cause problems with the fence. It's very, you know, animals can actually dig holes under it as well. So yeah, you need to be maintaining it. So the way that it doesn't actually keep animals in, so things like possums and goannas can actually climb over the fence and fall off the floppy top, but it does stop cats and foxes and other things climbing in. There's actually a live wire that runs along the length of around the whole entire perimeter, and then the floppy top, if something does get past the live wire, the floppy top stops them from actually climbing over it. So I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but other than to say that eradication is a very huge undertaking, and it's very resource intense. And you can see that there is a multi-step process before AWC is actually prepared to call something that's eradication free, which is in the green box there. So we need to do all of our eradication methods, of which we throw everything at it. So trapping, baiting, shooting, and then we have a process of you know, making a decision around, all right, we think there's eradication, but then moving into a very intense monitoring phase for 2 months before eradication. And you can see that once eradication's been called, there's still ongoing monitoring that has to be done to maintain that feral predator-free status. So, and for anyone who's local may have heard of Rambo the fox. It's taken us, we had the fence go in, I've got a few nods here, 2018 the fence went in, and it's only been in February that we have been able to call complete eradication in the larger fenced area. Thankfully we had a smaller fenced area that was eradication free, that's enabled us to reintroduce animals that we actually needed them in a smaller area for genetic mixing. But the larger area has been the home of one sole very wily fox that has only just, at the end of the last year we believe the floods took the fox out. So very wily animal. Some of the other land management things that we do, as I've touched on, is eradication of herbivores as well inside the fence. So pretty much all the pigs are gone except for one pig, and all the goats except for one goat. So we pretty much have one goat, one pig, one fox, all subsisting in there for 4 years. But obviously the pigs and the goats are not so much of like having one pig and a goat is not so much of an issue. We do control of feral predators and herbivores outside the fence as well in that broader 35,000 hectare area. And the reason for that is because we want to see, you know, with increased resourcing going into these feral species control, what that looks like for the existing native species and the forest outside the fence. But we also are in the process of developing an outside the fence strategy, because we would really love at some point to get to the point that we could maintain densities of foxes and cats at low enough levels that we could allow some of our reintroduced species to be outside the fence. We control fire management, and I've talked about fence maintenance. I won't go into too many details about those, but so let's get on to the The cute fluffies. So these are, we have 6 regionally extinct species, and just to emphasise that all of these species I'm talking about did once upon a time occur in the Pilliga forest. We've either got fossil records or written records of their existence there. I will be flashing up maps of their distribution, what their past distribution is like, so you can get a sense of how severely these guys have contracted in their range. And the other thing to mention just quickly before I go through the species is that all these species have been extinct from New South Wales, except for the plains mouse, for well over 100 years. So being able to bring them back into New South Wales and establish a population is pretty exciting. So the Bilby, Greater Bilby, or Bilba in Gamilaroi language, was reintroduced in December 2018. So the first species to go in with 60 founders. As you can see, the green dots on this map are where the species still exists, which is pretty much in Northern Territory, in Northern Territory and Northern WA. But you can see it was once very widespread and was widespread across New South Wales. We've got Bridled Nailtail Wallaby, or Marara, which was reintroduced a year later in September 2019 with 42 founders. This one is a really critical species to get extra to develop or build extra populations for, because there is only one remnant population left in Queensland, in an area that has subsequently been made a national park by the Queensland Government to protect this species. It was actually thought to be extinct until 1976 it was rediscovered. So pretty exciting species to get back into the Pilliga, and it's doing amazingly well. And you can see that it did have a fairly wide distribution across the east coast, or the eastern side of Australia. The third species is brush-tailed bettong, who we brought in last year in September with 55 founders from WA. Very important in dispersing fungal spores, and as you can see, it was once widespread and really now only occurs in the very southwest of WA. So to be able to start to get that back into some other areas of Australia is really critical, and I'll talk about some of the benefits of reintroducing these species in a minute. The plains mice, one of my little favourites. We harvested this animal from arid South Australia last year, and it's gone into captive breeding. With the smaller rodents, we really need to bring them in large numbers because they're much more susceptible to predation from native predators, and their survival is not expected to be high as our other species. We've got 211 animals we're bringing in June, so that's really exciting. And they have just recently been rediscovered out in Sturt National Park. So they're just hanging on in the very corner of New South Wales, but it will be great to get them back into the Pilliga. Really critical, there were 11 species of rodent in the Pilliga, across the Pilliga forest, and there's only one, the Pilliga mouse, that remains. So it's really nice for us to have a rodent on our reintroduced. And then we've got the Western Barred Bandicoot, which we're planning to reintroduce at the end of this year. And same story. This one, like the Bridled Nailtail Wallaby, is very restricted to only 2 remnant populations on islands off the coast of WA. So it is completely extinct. Wild populations all extinct from the mainland. So, and you can imagine that if something goes wrong with either of those 2 island populations, this species would be doomed, essentially. So that is one of the critical reasons for us to try to have more populations of these species, is for the conservation of them and to have these insurance populations, particularly for the bettong and the nailtail wallaby, that are restricted to such small, 1 and 2 populations. If anything goes wrong with those populations, which is very likely that it could with climate change impacts or disease, the bandicoots are very susceptible to several diseases, then they're gone. So the benefits of reintroducing them to parts of their former range is that you're building these insurance populations. And in doing that, we're increasing the global population size and the area occupancy, which is very important for their conservation. And I think one of the really exciting things about the Pilliga project is the potential contribution it can make to the genetic diversity for these species. It was part of their former range, but they haven't occurred in this, and for a lot of the species, particularly the bilby and the bandicoot, they haven't occurred and the plains mice, they haven't occurred in this sort of more mesic, sort of wetter environment. Like, it's semi-arid, but it's still higher rainfall than where they currently exist. So the potential is that in them adapting to the conditions here, that it's going to select for quite unique traits within our animals that are born here and established here, which is going to add to the genetic diversity of the species. So the Pilliga project is quite exciting from that perspective. And the other important thing is not only, of this project and projects like it, is that it's not only beneficial for the species, but it's beneficial for the Pilliga forest in terms of the important ecosystem functions these species provide. So the digging mammals, we have no digging mammals in the Pilliga anymore, and they're considered ecosystem engineers because they're so important in influencing the soils and nutrient cycling and moisture retention in the soil, which is all important for the health of the forest, and making sure that you get seedling germination and seedling establishment. So they perform very important things. The bettongs, as I mentioned, are important dispersers of fungal spores, and bilbies can be as well. And just, essentially restoring that biodiversity of those mammals to the Pilliga. I think it's worth it just for that, to get some of those 26 species back. So I just go through some of the outcomes of our introductions to date, and keeping in mind that what we're working towards ultimately is for self-sustaining populations that are breeding well, that are, maintaining population size. They're all sort of arid, semi-arid species that are very used to their population sizes increasing, decreasing during dry conditions, increasing when conditions are good. So we're expecting that up and down, but we need to make sure that they're maintained at a certain level that they can be sustained without us interfering. We don't want to have to be bringing more animals back in, so the idea is self-sustaining. And I think we've got a really good chance in the Pilliga of achieving that. So we have a range of indicators and metrics that we use against which we measure success. So the first one is survival of our founders. And I can happily say we've had really high survival, over 80% survival for all of our 3 species that we've brought in. The next thing we look at is the condition and the weight and the body condition of our animals, and they're all doing really well. So as an example, the little bettongs just down here on the bottom there, which came in September, within a 3-month period, we had the males put on average 6% in body weight and the females 11% in body weight. So that is a really fantastic outcome. It means that they've hit the ground running, they've got here, they've found food, they've found shelter, and the Pilliga is providing good food resources that they were able to put on body weight, because it is a very stressful experience for them. So for them to do that in 3 months is pretty incredible. We want to see that they're moving across the fenced area and starting to use available habitats, which we track them, and we have confirmed that. The other thing that we want to be looking at is their population growth. So first of all, looking at, well, are the females breeding? And we have had a high percentage of females in breeding condition every time we trap. We trap twice a year of all these species. So when we trap, we closely check pouch young and record lots of information about the numbers of pouch young, and the different size, so that we can age them. And we usually have percentage of females in breeding condition is usually sort of 50 to 75% or more. And with our bettongs in December, when we trapped after 3 months of them coming in, all of our females had pouch young. So that was really exciting. Then we want to make sure that it's not just about confirming that they're breeding and they have pouch young, but then are they successfully weaning those young and recruiting juveniles into the population? So once again, trapping helps us do that. So the top image of the little young bettong is a little young male. He was still in the pouch, but he was pretty close to being booted out of the pouch and was certainly spending time out of it. But we also use camera images as well and see young at foot, and that helps us to know, to track as well, that they're successfully recruiting juveniles. And all of that helps us to build an idea of the population and how the population's increasing. And I'll show you some graphs in a minute. And we also want to ensure that they're maintaining genetic diversity. So genetics is something that is really important for these populations, and we use it a lot to inform decisions about where we source animals. So with our founders, we take a piece of tissue, a sample that we get analysed for genetics for every founder, and then we also collect the same tissue from all of our Pilliga-born animals so that we can track, that we're maintaining genetic diversity. So we have an objective to maintain 90% of the founding genetic diversity. The only species we've analysed so far is the Nailtail Wallabies, which was at the end of last year, and our I think from about 70 Pilliga-born animals, we had maintained 91% of genetic diversity founders. So they're tracking really, really well. Okay, so just some quick results in terms of population. So with the Greater Bilby, you can see that overall it's been a growing trend, and as we're progressing years, that trend's getting steeper. You will notice that there has been a little bit of a drop-off, but still within the confidence range of the July sample. The last one is December, but that is probably a real drop-off, a little drop-off, because we did have the Pilliga project area was flooded twice last year, so October and November. These guys have have burrow networks underground, so it was probably very likely that some young animals or animals got caught in burrows when it literally flash flooded very, very quickly. So some of them may not have had a chance to get out of burrows. But you can see the bottom one is from our cameras, and it's an activity, what we refer to as an activity indice. So activity is often related to the numbers of animals, and you can see that really sort of, I suppose, mirrors the population increase, that it's on the right track. We're pretty confident that they're doing very well. We have been out there doing night work since that December trapping, and there's lots of babies running, like little juveniles running around. So I think they're going to bounce back really well. And I think it is testament to how resilient these animals are, that you can bring them into this foreign area, really, and they establish and, dealing with floods and whatnot. The Bridled Nailtail Wallaby is the same, showing an increase. It hasn't been as marked as the bettongs, the Bilbies, but they're certainly on the right track. And you can see from the activity indices as well that it's continuing to increase. So, that's pretty much the reintroduced species. I just want to quickly mention that we do have a fairly comprehensive monitoring program, both inside and outside the fence, because we're not only interested in our reintroduced animals, but we're interested to understand what impacts the reintroduced animals have. So to do that, we need to be able to compare inside and outside, and we're also interested to know, what the fence does and removing the predators does for other species. And we're getting some very positive benefits of the fence and removal of predators and herbivores. So I've just got two examples to share with you. One is the yellow-footed antechinus, which is a little dasyurid. These guys are little predators, eat lots of insects and can eat reptiles and whatnot, and other mammals. And you can see the green is inside the fence, and the blue is outside the fence. And the line is when the fence was put in mid-2018. So you can see that there has been a population explosion of yellow-footed antechinus. It's really exploded in the last couple of years because the conditions have been so great. So really good conditions with above average rainfall and release from predators, probably particularly cats, but probably also foxes, has made a real difference for these guys, which is really nice to see. And they're now 10 times higher abundance inside the fence than outside. And the other one of note is the painted button quail, one of my favourites. They're so beautiful, which is a ground nesting bird. So these guys are very susceptible. They spend pretty much all their time on the ground, and the chicks, their nests are on the ground. They're not particularly well protected, and the chicks are very, very vulnerable when they first hatch. So these guys are, you know, once again with the good conditions, enabling, you know, good breeding success, being inside that fence and not with feral predators is making a huge difference for these guys, which is great. And yeah, so just in summary, you know, just to mention that I think fenced areas and holistic landscape management, because it's not just about the fence here, it is about that bigger management across a much bigger landscape inside and outside the fence, are important parts of the solution. It's not the only solution by any means, and I really do hope that one day we get to the point where we do not need fences. Would be really nice, but they are at the moment an important part of solution for restoring our natural areas and protecting you know, really, yeah, improving outcomes for some of our more highly threatened species. So, and biodiversity in general, because you can see from the antechinus, like, you know, those sorts of densities were probably what they were, as well as a whole heap of other rodents. But because of foxes and cats, while they're still there, and they're not doing so well. And while the Pilliga project's still in its infancy, I think it's in the right direction, and we're starting to see some good stuff happening. Thank you very much for your time. And we do have thresholds like lower and upper targets. At the moment, our upper targets are just we've just done our best to estimate that from known densities, but obviously the Pilliga will probably support higher densities, so we will need to adjust that as we go. But that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right, and that's one of the reasons that we need to monitor long term, is to firstly confirm what those upper targets are, and we'll be able to confirm that over time as population increases, because as long as you're still measuring breeding rates, and getting indications of young and measuring body condition, you know when it is getting to an upper target, because you'll start to see changes in those things. So as long as we keep monitoring that stuff, we'll be able to define a pretty good upper target. And obviously that upper target will vary according to the conditions at the time. Like at the moment, the conditions are really great, so the upper target will probably be at the highest it will be. But these guys will self-regulate, so when it goes into drought, they'll naturally drop down. Yeah, absolutely. All of these species are arid, semi-arid species, and that is a normal part of their cycle, that they will self-regulate. So we know they will self-regulate, but obviously when the conditions are really good, we do need to probably that's when we need to keep an eye on them and make sure. But yeah, it's a very good question, and that's why we ultimately need to get to the point where we don't need fences, because we will need to keep monitoring and managing these populations until you don't have any fences anymore.